Good morning, Sophia. So we're finally leaving Polonnaruwa, and we are making our way up north towards the city of Mullaitivu. It's actually in the northeast of the country. Mullaitivu, Sophia, lies in that part of Sri Lanka that was once imagined would become a separate Tamil nation state. This is the nation state of Tamil Elam that the LTTE and hundreds of thousands of Tamils, both in Sri Lanka and in the diaspora, had dreamt would become their national homeland. So the imaginary of Tamil Elam as a separate homeland emerges in the 1950s, 1960s, which was not surprising given that that is precisely how communities all around the globe were imagining the form their liberation, their sovereignty would take. Nation states were emerging all around the globe, anti-colonial movements trying to escape the oppressions of empire and of imperialism were at their height. So it's not surprising that a Tamil people facing discrimination, facing repression, facing marginalization in a newly independent Sri Lanka. Remember, Sri Lanka became independent in 1948. It was not unusual for the Tamils to imagine that their liberation, their freedom, lay in having a separate nation state. So this is not the place to talk about the emergence of the nation state as the dominant form of liberation that most societies emerging from under the yoke of imperialism and empire in the wake of the Second World War, that most societies chose that. Practically every anti-colonial struggle ended up imagining itself as a nation state struggle. But the book that I think really provides the definitive history and understanding about how this idea became dominant, how the pursuit of the nation state came to be seen as really the final manifestation of struggles of liberation, is Adam Getachow's book, World Making After Empire. This is an incredibly exciting, interesting text, and I think it's the one that best answers this question. Now, through this text, of course, we get access to other texts, Geographies of Liberation, No Enchanted Palace. Those are texts that I may talk about later. I will post them here so that we can see. But I think between these three texts or four texts that I may mention, if you are curious about how does the nation state become the principal imaginary, and in the 50s and 60s, as the Tamils are facing the issues that they're facing in Sri Lanka, it's inevitable that they themselves and their leadership, political, military, and otherwise, would imagine that the only way for them to have freedom, the only way for them to achieve equality, the only way for them to have liberation is to have a nation state of their own. And I think Getachow's book is how you need to understand that at that particular time and place, that really was the only political solution in an oppressed community could conceive of. So by the 1950s, the Tamils too imagined their own geography of liberation and freedom. And it is relatively easy to understand why. Because soon after the creation of the state of Ceylon, emerging from under British colonial rule, there were a long series of political and legislative and violent actions taken that signaled to the Tamils that they were not going to be equal citizens of the new country, and that the majority Buddhist and Sinhalese population was determined to marginalize them. Now, I don't have the space here to go through a detailed timeline, but I just want to kind of highlight some of the main events that lead up to the war, the Civil War. So in 1948, Ceylon gains independence, and it's in 1956 that the Sinhala Only Act, and you remember we talked about this, about the Prime Minister Bandaranaike, whose statue we photographed in Polonnaruwa. The 1956 Sinhala Only Act that privileges Sinhalese as the official language of the country and completely ignores Tamil as one. We have the 1958 anti-Tamil riots that took place under this growing Sinhalese Buddhist nationalism frenzy. We have in 1971 a government that introduces these new discriminatory university admission policies that discriminate against the Tamils. 1972, Sri Lanka is born, i.e. Ceylon changes its name to Sri Lanka, and then Buddhism that year is declared as the principal faith of the country, again telling the Tamils, who are largely Hindu, that they are not of the land. 1976 is when the LTTE, Soviet, is born. Prabhakaran creates this organization and begins an armed struggle for Tamil liberation. 1977, a general election that sees massive anti-Tamil riots, maybe 300 people are killed. And then, of course, the big event in 1983, when the LTTE attacks an army convoy in Jaffna, which triggers anti-Tamil riots across the country from Colombo to other major cities, and possibly 3,000 or more Tamils are killed. These are just some of the high points about a growing marginalization, separation, and division between the two communities in Sri Lanka. So Tamil Eelam, of course, never came to be, and that dream of a separate Tamil homeland died in the early weeks of 2009. But during the course of the Civil War, during the height of LTTE power, there were long periods of time when the northeast of Sri Lanka was under the control of the LTTE, and places like Kilinochchi, Mullaitivu, parts of Manar, and Vavunia, those are the areas that I'm riding through now, were a form of sanctuary for Tamils who came here from different places trying to escape not just the Ceylonese army itself, but also riots in Colombo or rioting crowds in Colombo. And they came to this area in the hope that armed Tamils, right, the LTTE, could protect them from the Sinhalese, and they had reason to seek this protection. I promised to introduce you to some books that bring us more into the contemporary history of the Civil War. But the first one that I want to introduce you to is this fantastic text by Rohini Mohan called The Seasons of Trouble. Rohini is a journalist, and this is a work of non-fiction, but I would call it more a work of creative non-fiction. She bases the entire book around the lives of 3 Tamil characters, and the book is written largely about what happened to them in the wake of the end of the Civil War. So in the text itself, you have a story of Sarva, who was picked up by the Sri Lankan state, who then ends up wandering lost in asylum-seeking programs around the world. His mother, Indra, who after Sarva's effective kidnapping by the state spends her life looking for her son. And then Mugil, who is a former child soldier, a female child soldier, who's just simply struggling to rebuild her home and find some degree of normalcy in her life. But this one really gets to the heart of the question of what war does to lives, right? Away from the jingoism, away from the victory celebrations, away from all the nationalism and flag waving and heroism and machismo. I think Rohini manages to help us understand how war just leaves millions simply struggling to find ways to make the everyday work. And the way in which the scars play out in such complex and really sometimes unfathomable ways for individual lives.
unexpected war memorial. I didn't expect to run into this, but it wasn't listed anywhere. But I'm not sure. This monument, I read it says Civil Defense Memorial. Yeah. So it's good. Vanya and then Kilinochi. Yeah, but I go straight to Kilinochi. So thanks.
This here, Sophia, is the infamous A9 highway. The A9 is like an umbilical cord that connects the south of Sri Lanka with the north. And during the Civil War, it was more often than not closed. It was heavily fought over. The LTTE controlled, obviously, the northern parts of it, which meant that it was effectively closed most of the time. And in fact, Rohini Mohan, in her book, refers to the A9 as a measure of the divide between the people of the island. When it was, when things were relatively calmer, there was traffic allowed on the road. When things really fell apart, the A9 was completely closed off.
Yeah, just easy. I'm gonna have a coffee. Maybe I'm tempted to eat something. It looks pretty nice. Let's see. Out again and continue this journey. Okay, just a normal police check post. Took a short break. Really nice guys. And we move on.
At the end of the war, Sophia, the A9 was made, again, in Rohini Mohan's words, into a victory monument. Now, what she means by that is that the A9 became kind of an injection through which a policy of Sinhalization was enacted on the reconquered regions of the north after the defeat of the LTTE. And along the entire stretch of this highway, the state and the military built new Buddhist stupas and viharas. They planted Bodhi trees. Of course, a number of military bases and camps were built all along the stretch as well. And various victory monuments also exist along the stretch of the highway, and we will visit some of these victory monuments in future episodes. We are soon arriving in Mullaitivu, Sophia. So in the last days of the war, these roads that I'm riding through now were filled with people fleeing the advancing Sri Lankan army. With the fall of Kilinochi in January 2009, the writing was on the wall and the LTTE was in full retreat and moving towards Mullaitivu and these eastern shores. But these people were not just fleeing the Sri Lankan army, they were also being forced by the LTTE to march towards these towns, because the LTTE used civilians as possibly as human shields, but it definitely used them to continue to recruit and find young men who could be forced to pick up arms and confront the Sri Lankan army. Many, many people died as a result of this practice, and it is ironic that the very organization, the very militia that once proclaimed to be fighting for Tamil liberation inevitably became, in the closing months, some would argue even in the closing years of this war, became one of the most oppressive and exploitative forces the Tamils had to deal with. What happened in Mullaitivu in the last weeks of the war is something we will talk about in coming episodes. This will also bring us to some other fabulous readings and books, both fiction and non-fiction, and we'll talk about that a little bit further on.